Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly, drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. He was born into a name that opened doors before he ever learned to knock. Call him Jonah Mercer. His father, Councilman Daniel Mercer, had the kind of smile that made cameras tilt closer. He had a handshake that meant favors and a schedule that made newspapers. The family lived in a town of old institutions and newer ambitions, where flags flew neat and polite on government days, and everyone somewhere carried a ledger of owed favors. From the outside, Jonah's life looked like a glossy magazine spread. Evening galas, polo matches, school photos in immaculate blazers. From the inside, Jonah felt hollow. Jonah failed every test. Math numbers scrambled into shapes he could not follow. Literature passages turned into doors he had no key for. History seemed like stories other people told loudly, while the facts danced out of reach. Teachers stopped raising their voices at him. They filled in the same rehearsed lines: try harder, attend a tutor, stay after class. And then they turned their pages and moved on. Classmates learned to smirk before they even saw his paper. The red marks on his work became a language he no longer translated. At home, the pressure was not quiet. Daniel Mercer was a man who believed the world should look a certain way. The Mercer name meant votes, fundraisers, and favors passed like currency. At dinner, the television often played footage of the councilman standing in front of a ribbon cutting or shaking hands at a hospital wing named after his donors. Over and over, Jonah sat at the end of the long dining room table and ate food prepared by chefs who did not know his name. "You are not a story I care to have written badly," his father would say, smooth as glass and twice as cold. He never yelled much. He didn't need to. His disappointment had the subtler cruelty of a judge who knows the sentence, but never shows mercy. "You are heir to reputation. You already have more than most. Do not squander that." Jonah shrank into the corners of rooms as if he could make himself smaller than the expectations. He wore designer jackets that hung on him like borrowed sails. He developed a habit of smiling where he did not mean it and of walking like his feet might give way at any time. The painless luxury around him was a constant reminder that he had to be perfect, even though the bones of the person inside him kept collapsing. The school was an old building with marble steps and portraits of alumni with square jaws and sharper eyes. It smelled like lemon cleaner and paper. There were gilded plaques in the front hall and trophies under glass. Jonah drifted past them like an element that did not belong. One rainy afternoon, after another failing grade, he wandered to the east corridor, where the floors were quieter and the lockers less polished. The rain made the hall sparkle, but it did little to warm him. That's where he noticed her. She was at the far end of the hallway, moving a mop in steady circles. She was a black woman with a scarf tied loosely at the nape of her neck, a few silver hairs escaping at the edge. Her jacket was the worn uniform of the night crew. Her gloves bore the faint stains of long labor. She moved with a calm that belonged to people who knew darkness and had learned to carry light through it. Jonah hardly registered her at first. Custodians were part of the background the way faucets and ceiling tiles were. They were important, sure, but invisible. People rarely spoke to them as if they were people who had whole stories inside them. He leaned against the wall and let the paper with the red F fall from his hands into his jacket. The sound of it hitting the tile seemed loud. He wanted familiarity, an old joke, a class clown, anything to distract from the ache. But the janitor did something unexpected. She spoke, not at him, but as if she were answering a question she had been asked long ago. "The thing about failing," she said quietly, "is that most people want to stamp it out. They don't want to let it breathe." He turned. "What?" She smiled without showing her teeth. "They mop a stain and pretend it never existed. But sometimes a stain teaches you about the fabric. Sometimes you need to study the stain." Something in the cadence of her voice made his chest loosen. A little. She looked like she had learned how to listen to small things and find meaning there. He had never had that. Her name, Jonah learned, was Miriam Tate. She was in her late 50s. Though age didn't tell the whole story, people in the school had called her many things: night crew, cleaner, janitor. He discovered later that Miriam once taught literature at a small community college, had a neat stack of published essays that only a handful of people had read, and had been the kind of teacher whose students stayed in touch long after graduation. Life had pulled her away from the classroom. Loss and necessity had pushed her along a different path. She did not name her reasons. She simply mopped and hummed and walked as if every corridor contained lessons. Jonah did not go home that night and try to figure any of it out. He went to his room and opened his drawer and looked at the trophies his parents had never wanted to truly celebrate. He thought about the way his father's gaze skimmed his face like a surface, never trying to reach inside. He felt tired of pretending he could carry the Mercer name like armor when it made him bleed. The next morning, he found Miriam near the library polishing a brass door handle. She did not look at him until he fidgeted into a position near her. He swallowed. "You said last night that stains can teach you about the fabric," Jonah said, the words leaving in a quick rush. Miriam set the polishing cloth down and met his eyes. "You are drawn to metaphors." He gave a weak laugh. "I didn't study metaphors. I failed the test." She placed her palm lightly on the wood of the door, as if she were remembering the grain of the world. "We all fail tests. Some are written by men who write rules. Some are written by life itself." "Which test do you mean?" He told her about the history exam, the numbers that no longer made sense, the sentences that read like riddles. He told her about the way his father's disappointment landed like a book on his chest. He told her what it felt like to be a roomer in his own house. Miriam listened. Then she said, small as a bell, "If you want to be a different kind of person, you have to learn to unmake what you think you are." He blinked. "Unmake what I think I am?" "Yes. Take apart the pieces people gave you, fears, jokes, gifts, and see which ones fit. Then build from there." She handed him a thin spiral notebook pulled from the pocket of her apron. The cover was taped at the edge, the pages soft with use. "Write in this. Not to impress a tutor or to get your father's nod. Write until you surprise yourself." Jonah took the notebook home like it was an offering. He slept badly that night and woke early with the taste of something raw on his tongue, the feeling of possibility like a faint bell. He wrote a single sentence. "I am more than the name on my shirt." It felt both childish and like a revolution. He smoothed the paper and went to school with his chest a fraction less tight. Miriam's methods were not the drills he had seen in expensive tutoring centers. She did not hand him formula sheets or memorize lists. She handed him questions he had never been asked and waited as if she trusted him to figure them out. "Read this paragraph," she'd say, and then ask, "What did it make your body do? Where did your eyes land? What did it leave you wanting to ask?" He hated it at first. He wanted the answers. He wanted the neat path. But what Miriam taught him was a softer kind of toughness. She taught him that attention was a muscle and that understanding was a practice, not a lightning strike. She taught him that failure could be a map if you knew how to hold it. Days turned into weeks. Every morning before classes started, he met her in the library's back corner. She would brew cheap coffee in a thermos and give him pieces of paper covered in questions. He began to read books he would not have chosen on his own. He read poets who unspooled their feelings in small lines, and historians who told stories of people trying to bend the arc of life. He read essays that were angry and essays that were shy and essays that kept asking the same question in different ways. Slow changes happened, not the sudden lightning of a miracle. Instead, he began to notice things. A line in a passage would catch his eye. A problem in algebra would no longer look like a wall, but like a puzzle. He learned to reframe questions and to write his confusion down until it made sense. He learned to fail and then to ask why the failure existed. He learned to stay in the space of not knowing without panicking. The more he learned, the more the school noticed. Whispers followed him like a draft. "He's getting lessons from the janitor." Some students snickered in the cafeteria. Others rolled their eyes like it was a joke. Teachers raised eyebrows at his new interest in class. His father called the house more often, asking indirect questions about study groups and tutors. "Jonah, are you getting help?" "Who is helping you?" He said simply, "A woman named Miriam." There was always static on the line after that. The way his father pronounced her name had the sharp, dismissive tilt of someone who decides who matters and who doesn't. "A janitor, Jonah." "Are you serious?" His father's voice was low and thin. "Do not embarrass us." The threat of embarrassment became a drumbeat. It kept time with every step Jonah took. But inside, another music had started to play, a rhythm made of curiosity and small triumphs. Once, after a late-night session, he walked into class with a poem on his lips, and when he raised his hand, it stayed steady. No one laughed. People listened. A teacher who had stopped trying to coax him into participating folded her hands and smiled like a miracle. As Jonah changed, Miriam pressed him harder. She wanted more than surface answers. "You do the work," she'd say, "and I'll sit with the hard parts. But you must sit with them first." Miriam's past came into view slowly, through small confessions that sounded like the warm tones of old wood. She had once stood at a podium and given a lecture on poets who made the ordinary a temple. Her students had loved her because she made them feel entrusted. But then, after a scandal at the college where she worked, an accusation she fought, in a dean who protected his own, her life tilted. She had refused to stay silent when she thought truth mattered. There were consequences. Papers stopped calling. Colleagues kept their distance. Bills arrived like unkind letters. She took a job that paid less but kept her voice steady. The night shift at the school, where she could still walk the silent halls and read into the small hours. Jonah listened to that story like someone holding a glass to hear a heartbeat. He thought of his own father's decisions and the way power sometimes hid inconvenient things beneath its suits. Miriam never asked pity. She just told him, plainly, that life had taken from her some things and given others. She had less money now, she had less title, but she had a certain kind of authority that was not written on paper. It came from the quiet of nights spent reading to empty rooms, from lessons that did not care about applause, from values that survived when everything else had been stripped away. Slowly, other students came. It began with a girl named Naomi, who had always sat at the back of biology class and never raised her hand. A boy named Marco, who worked weekends and had dry ink on his fingers. They arrived at the library where Miriam worked with a hesitant sort of courage. They brought their own wounds, parents who did not speak enough, bills that choked, dreams that were too big for the neighborhoods that hosted them. Miriam treated them all with the same steady hunger for truth. The sessions became small and secret. They read Baldwin and Oakley and D'Angelo. They read essays about shame and privilege, and the small ways people hurt one another. They wrote and rewrote. They pressed their hands to paper until their sentences had weight. Word moved like a soft rumor. Some teachers watched them with curiosity. Others watched them with a thin, sharp edge. The administration got nervous. A school concerned with rankings and donors looked at an after-hours cluster of kids led by a woman with an apron and asked questions about liability and image. One afternoon, the assistant principal called Miriam into the office. Jonah's stomach turned. When she returned to the hallway, her face was the same calm mask she always wore, but her hands were folded so that he knew something heavy had happened. "They told me to stop," she said simply. "You'll stop?" Jonah asked, though the question was honest and raw. Miriam shook her head. "I can't quit. Not with these kids, they are hungry. And I will not have a school where only some people are allowed to be students." "Then fight," Jonah said, youth and fury rising inside him. He had been learning how to sit with pain without collapsing. He could do something now. He wanted to do something. "Not with noise," Miriam said. "With work. With your voice." The school announced an end-of-year speech contest topic: what it means to win in life. The auditorium would be full. Families would come. Local news might be there. For Jonah, it was more than a contest. It was a stage built of possibility and danger. If he spoke the truth, it might fracture something at home. If he kept quiet, he would lose the chance to tell the world who he had become. He worked until his eyes hurt. He wrote drafts until the spiral of Miriam's notebook bent with use. He rehearsed in empty classrooms and in his car. He let the words move like a slow tide inside him, clearing and returning. He wanted to say what Miriam had taught him, that failure could be a doorway, that power was not in name, but in the work one did to grow beyond it. On the night of the contest, the auditorium smelled of perfume and old varnish. People rustled and whispered. Jonah felt like a small thing dressed in a suit that still felt huge. He walked to the stage and saw his father in the audience, a face like a cliff, not expressing much. His hands tightened at his sides. "My name is Jonah Mercer," he began. The voice that emerged was steadier than he expected. It carried the weight of what he had lived through. "I was born into a name like a coat that someone else chose for me. I wore it because everyone said it fit. I wore it because it opened doors. I wore it until I realized the coat had pockets for other people's things and not mine." He told the story of failing tests, of empty dinners, of a man who asked him to be perfect without telling him how to become it. He talked about the night he met Miriam in the hallway and the simple sentence she gave him. He spoke of the notebook and the slow mornings and the way other students started to come and stay. "I learned that the secret is this," Jonah said, and the auditorium felt like it leaned forward, as if everybody there wanted to hear the exact sound of it. "You don't have to be born with power to practice it. You can earn it every day by seeing people and giving them your time and your truth. My teacher is not the one at the front with the chalk. My teacher is the woman who cleans the floors at night, who taught me how to listen to sentences the way you listen to people. She taught me how to fail without dying." He held a page of his notebook high and looked toward the back. Miriam sat alone in the dark, her face a quiet lighthouse. For a moment he saw something change in his father's expression, a crack in the stone. When Jonah finished, there was a long, stunned silence. Then slowly, applause started. It grew until the auditorium felt like it might lift. Cameras were on him now, recording every breath. Reporters clicked. The video would be uploaded in minutes. In the sea of applause, Jonah felt a new kind of currency, one that did not weigh him down but lifted him, like air under wings. The reaction after was a storm with edges. Phone calls from journalists interested in the politician's son who credited the janitor arrived like rain. Opinion pieces bloomed. Some dismissed it as a clever performance. Others said it was a signal of a new kind of politics. Less about name, more about humanity. Many people read Jonah's lines as a rebuke not only to him, but to a system that championed privilege and hid its harmful edges. At home, the fallout was quieter and more painful. Daniel Mercer's staff called him to talk about optics. His father said little at first, like someone turning a heavy key. But then he called Jonah into his study. The room smelled of oak and paper. He did not shout. He did not lash. He asked questions like a man trying to make sense of a new map. "Who gave you the word?" he said, with a voice that had always been able to steer meetings and shape budgets. There was fear there, though he masked it, the fear of losing control. "A woman named Miriam. She taught me to read the spaces between words," Jonah answered truthfully. Silence, then a thin, sharp laugh. "A janitor," Daniel said. The word was a blade. "What does she know of policy? Of public life? You can't hang the family name on that." Jonah felt something open inside him, an old wound, and he could not bend to the old demands to hide it. "She knows how to teach," he said. "She knows how to save someone's life with her words. Maybe she is not the kind of person your polling team respects, but she is the person who saved mine." Time unspooled then like a rope. There were bad nights, anonymous threats to Miriam's job, a handful of donors who fussed with the school, local members of the community who whispered. There were good nights too, invitations for Miriam to speak at a community lecture, a small college offering her a visiting appointment, students who wrote notes about how their lives were reshaped. Unseen, a larger truth began to change. A few journalists dug deeper into Miriam's history and discovered she had once been profiled in a regional magazine for how she translated complex poetry into things students could do. They found an essay she wrote about how language could be used to free people. The public was curious in a way that did not always fit the neat boxes of partisan debate. Some viewers were moved, some criticized. Social media split and folded, but Miriam's voice had found a wider ear. The school issued a statement, careful, measured, that praised after-school enrichment and then added the necessary clauses about supervision and certification. The assistant principal apologized for any confusion and promised to review policies. Miriam, with the dignity of someone who had been through worse storms, accepted the review, knowing rules were sometimes shields and sometimes prisons. Jonah did not want Miriam to be dragged into bureaucratic limbo. He spoke up at a community board meeting and said something that surprised him. He spoke of gratitude and of the need to see people who had been invisible. He asked the board to consider what education really meant. The room held its breath. A few people applauded, some shook their heads. But it was a beginning. Then one afternoon, something happened that felt like a betrayal to everything they had built. Miriam was called to the principal's office and informed that, due to budget constraints and liability concerns, her position would not be renewed. The school would be restructuring. She left that day with a box containing a few personal items and a stoic face that hid a deep hurt. Jonah found out before anyone else. He ran to the old parking lot where she often sat in the afternoons, sipping cheap coffee and reading a worn book. She looked up when he approached, and Jonah could not stop the sound that left his mouth. "No," he said, like a small animal stunned. "You can't leave." Miriam folded her hands around the cup. "They have reasons that sound like paper. But they do not get to rewrite my heart, Jonah. I will keep reading. I will keep teaching where I can." "You taught me everything," Jonah said, and the words were simple and true. "You saved me." She blinked, the smallest warmth in her eyes. "You saved yourself when you showed up too." The way the world turned after her departure was messy and raw. There were fundraisers to hire legal counsel. There were petitions and local rallies. There were friends who spoke up on social media. The public square has a habit of forcing small stories into larger frames. Miriam found herself at the center of something she had not sought. People who had never looked at the janitorial staff in their schools began to wonder about who else had stories they did not know. Jonah felt rage and love braid together inside him. He started a small fund to help Miriam with housing and bills. He wrote op-eds about education and access. He spoke at community centers about humility and about the need to listen to people who had lived experience rather than a neat line on a resume. The Mercer name had always been used to open doors. Now Jonah used it to build a small set of them for other people. Time passed with the usual stubbornness. Jonah graduated. He turned down a full scholarship at a university where his father's connections could have paved a smoother path. Instead, he chose a smaller program focusing on education and community work. He wanted to learn the way Miriam taught, with hands and patience, with inquiry rather than performance. Miriam's life smoothed in different ways. A small liberal arts college invited her to give guest lectures and later offered her a steady adjunct position. She taught adult education classes and evening seminars. She found again the rhythm of a classroom. She did not become a celebrity. She did not want that. She wanted students who would come into a space and leave different from when they arrived. Years later, the two of them stood in a small community hall and cut the ribbon on a modest place they called the Harbor House, an after-school center that offered reading classes, quiet shifts for students who worked, and a place where those who felt unseen could practice the art of being seen. The center was partly Jonah's vision and partly Miriam's steady insistence. It was not fancy. It did not glitter with donors' plaques. It was a room with books, tables, and volunteers who believed in listening. At the opening, Daniel Mercer stood at the back. He had aged in the way people do when they are forced to re-examine what they value. He watched Jonah speak and watched Miriam nod, and in his face were the first signs of a kind of humility that had rarely sat there before. Later, when Jonah and his father stepped outside, they talked a long time. There were apologies and explanations and a slow folding of old armor into something softer. "I was wrong to think a name could do the work for a man," Daniel said finally. The words were simple. He worked at them like a man learning to say something he had never said aloud. "I thought I was protecting you by building a path you didn't need to walk. I see now that I built you a cage." Jonah let a laugh, bittersweet. "Come out." He put a hand on his father's shoulder. "It took losing a lot of things to find what matter," he said. "But you came." Miriam watched them from the doorway and smiled with a small secret joy. She was not entire forgiveness. She was not a rewriting of all the pain. She had earned the right to feel something small and true, that the work had not been in vain. In the years that followed, Harbor House became a quiet force. Kids came, sat with their eyes on the pages, and learned the discipline of curiosity. Teachers came to volunteer and left change. Parents sat in small circles and listened. Students who had been written off got letters of acceptance to colleges and trades and programs that wanted not just perfect grades, but people who had shown they could bend the arc of their lives. Jonah kept writing too. He wrote about failure and the way it could be a beginning. He wrote about the importance of seeing people across the halls of power and the low corridors where janitors worked. He did not write to be a martyr or a paragon. He wrote because he could not imagine not doing it. There was a private moment that stayed with Jonah. One rainy evening, with thunder like a restless audience, he sat at the small round table in the harbor house and unfolded a page from Miriam's old tape notebook. On it, she had written in a small, precise hand, "The first task of kindness is to see. The second task is to stay." He read it out loud and felt the words settle into him. They were a kind of map. He lifted his head and saw Miriam across the room, stacking chairs after a late class. A small laugh left him. He rose and walked to her carrying coffee. He set it down. "You did not save me," he said. She raised an eyebrow, the phantom of a teacher's skepticism. "Did not save you? I thought you saved yourself," she replied. He smiled. "You helped me find the tools." She looked at him, a small, serious nod. "Good. Then use them well." The city still had its politics and its small cruelties. There were people who thought Jonah was naive or self-important. There were people who argued that a name still mattered more than the work. But a small truth had spread. Names are not destinies. They are not cages unless we let them be. People can choose to remake themselves and the world in which they live. One spring morning, years after the speech, Jonah visited his old high school. The marble steps were a little less bright now, the portraits a little more familiar. He walked into the library and saw a young boy, shoulders tight with secrets, sitting at a table with a thin spiral notebook in his hands. Jonah sat down across from him and offered a cup of coffee. "That book is a good start," he said. "Who taught you to write in it?" The boy looked up, frightened, hopeful. "Miss, read in 10th grade," he said. "But she left last year." Jonah smiled. "Then let's write something that scares you. Start with the truth." As the boy put pen to paper, Jonah thought of all the small things it had taken. The notebook, the question, the long afternoons. Things that accumulate like pennies until one day you have enough to buy a life. He thought of Miriam, of his father, of those quiet sessions in the library that had seemed like secret weapons. He imagined a world where people did not have to be perfect to be taught, where a janitor's words could be part of a policy conversation. There is no tidy ending to lives. People continue to make mistakes and do wonders. But there are crossroads, and sometimes one small choice bends everything. If Jonah's story touched something in you, the way someone's quiet courage can shift a life, then think of someone you can tell. Pick up a neighbor's story, sit with a child's sentence. Give time, because time is a currency too. If you like this story, if it moved you, please subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear that names do not decide worth. And before you go, if you were moved, leave one small thing in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? A sunrise, a midnight, an afternoon? Tell us. These stories travel farther when we meet them together. I'll leave you with one more thing, because stories are not just for watching. They are for living. Be gentle with yourself. Be brave enough to fail. And when you see someone who seems invisible, look twice. The person who changes a life could be holding a mop, carrying a tray, or simply sitting quietly in the corner. The world needs more people who see and stay,